Now that we've discussed the taxonomic classification of organisms, let's get into one of the big questions in biology. What exactly is a species? Species it's one of the fundamental units of biology. So when we talk about a species, that's what we're saying. This is this fundamental unit in biology. The actual definition of a species, though, that's up for debate. And this has led to different groups of scientists advocating for different definitions and concepts, just based on how each discipline uses the term and the needs of that discipline to organize its knowledge. At last count, there were 24 different named species concepts, with even more alternative definitions. What I mean by that is, a definition when it comes to a species concept is a concise description of that concept. And different people have described those concepts using slightly different terminology based on where they work, how they work, what their background is, all that sort of stuff. Now, while this may not sound like that big of a deal, let me tell you, the connotations of words in a definition can cause all manner of miscommunication. It is a nightmare. So, quick aside, I work on a forensics national board where we work with wildlife forensics. And so our job is to start coming up with and getting information on standard operating procedures and things of that nature when it comes to wildlife forensics. One of our first real things was trying to define what we mean by a species. Because you hear that word bandied about all the time, right? Well, it's this species, it's that species. What did we mean by a species when it came to forensic or wildlife forensics? So that took about a year and a half of meetings and going back and forth and public comment and all this sort of stuff. And it came down to really minor tweaks and changes over time. And we had to discern what we meant by a species in terms of animals, in terms of forensics, and in terms of how we were going to use it in a court of law. And the definition we came up with isn't necessarily an all-encompassing species definition. It's not something that's going to work for bacteria or archaea or plants even. Nothing like that. We had to really define what we meant so that when somebody sits in a court and says the word species in terms of wildlife forensics, everybody knows what that definition is. So that's the type of problem we're running into, is we don't have an overarching species concept that works for every single living thing out there right now, just because it is so incredibly complex. So we end up seeing a whole bunch of different concepts. So many of the concepts and their associated different definitions are incompatible. They will define a subset of those living things out there, but when you try to apply them to anything or even records of what used to be living, like fossils, things start to break down. So this can lead to a bunch of problems. The biggest problem is if somebody asks you, how many species are there? Depending on the definition you use, you're going to have different numbers. If somebody wants you to include species that used to exist and now are extinct, you're going to have even different numbers. So you end up getting different conclusions concerning the boundaries and numbers of species. So while a group of organisms may be considered one species under one species concept, that group can be broken up into many different species under a different concept. And this is where the problems come into play. We are going to talk about some of the major species concepts out there. So I've gone through a whole mess of curriculum. I've gone through a whole bunch of different papers and concepts and things of that nature and tried to pick out those that are going to be most useful for when we're starting to think about carrion ecology and what we need to know in order to apply this information to whatever you want to apply this ecological information to. So this table that I have up here is just a sampling of some of these different species concepts along with the supporting documentation and the papers. You're going to find every few years somebody will come out and try to do, here's my new overarching species concept. And really all they do is they just make another species concept because then something else will come along and throw a wrench into it. And people are going to argue about this until the day humans leave this earth, I think. So it's just going to go on and on. I want you to know the most common definitions of species, those that you're going to see in various readings, those that you're going to be able to use in a practical sense when it comes to ecology. So that way, when people talk about species, when we discuss species, when you and I sit here and talk about these different species concepts or these different species types, you know what we're saying. Right? So there may be a few times when I say, okay, now let's start talking about this species concept. So just, you know where we're at. The biological species concept. This is probably the closest thing that biologists have to an overarching species concept. And this is likely the concept that you have learned throughout your schooling as the definition of a species. So in the biological species concept, this is a group of individuals that can breed together and create viable offspring. They cannot breed with other groups. Okay, so a group of interbreeding natural population that is reproductively isolated from other such groups. So when two organisms breed within a species that we define with the biological species concept, their genes are passed on and into their combined offspring. As this process is repeated, the genes of different organisms are constantly shuffled around in this species gene pool, and the shared gene pool gives the species its identity. So it's all of these genes, these possible combinations, all together in the single pool. By contrast, the genes are not by definition transferred to other species. So the particular things that make up a particular species, you're not going to find or see those things transferred into other species. So different species can take on different appearances because of that, because of those genes, because what those genes code for and how they create those phylogenetic or those phenotypic characteristics. So in order to be considered a single species in the biological species concept, a group of organisms must produce healthy, fertile offspring when they interbreed. So they must be able to produce viable offspring. So there are some cases where organisms of different species will interbreed and they will produce healthy offspring, but those offspring are infertile. So they can't reproduce. So for example, probably the most common example that I see and hear is when a female horse and a male donkey mate. They can still produce offspring, but those hybrid offspring are called mules, and those mules are healthy, but they are infertile. They cannot have their own offspring. So because of this, we consider horses and donkeys separate species. Of course, not long ago, a horse and a donkey made a hybrid mule, and that mule was able to produce viable offspring. So this is one of the many places where the biological species concept kind of breaks down, is we see some reshuffling of genes, we see some things happen, we see just, natural selection and evolution and mutations cropping up, and suddenly the definition doesn't quite work. But overall, it seems to work pretty well. So this biological species concept defines organisms as being or not being the same species based on whether or not they can interbreed and make fertile offspring. So then this leads to the question of why is it that different species can't interbreed? What makes it so they can't spread their genes across and create certain viable offspring? So this question might be silly for different species, like certain plant species that just aren't there, or certain animal species. But for others, like the horse and the donkey, where they're really closely related, it's much less obvious. So broadly speaking, different species are unable to interbreed and produce healthy, fertile offspring because of barriers that we call mechanisms of reproductive isolation. Some of the most common mechanisms of reproductive isolation I have listed for you here. The first is called habitat isolation. So in habitat isolation, the two organisms or the two animals simply live in different habitats. So in this case, we got these two different crickets. They're very closely related, but one is going to prefer very sandy soil. The other is going to prefer very loamy soil. Those two soil types will be nowhere near each other, which means that these two different species will be nowhere near each other, so they will not interbreed. They are isolated by their habitat. The second type is called temporal isolation. This is when the different species are out during different times of day or different times of the year. So there are some species that are daytime species, others that are only out at night. So they just don't cross paths. There are some species that are summer species, others that are winter. So even if they could interbreed, which maybe they can, they just don't run into each other, so they don't. The third type is called behavioral isolation. This is really common in those species that use some sort of cue for mating, either pheromones or singing. So like in the crickets or in the grasshoppers here, in order to mate, they actually create a song. They have the stridulation where they sing. They create that chirping in order to attract a member of the opposite sex. The song is what isolates them. So these crickets, say here, they can have a whole bunch of other different cricket species that could mate with them, but those cricket species are not attracted to that song. So only the same species, these conspecific, as we say, species, will be attracted to that particular song. So they have this behavioral isolation. Finally, mechanical isolation. This is something we see in certain fly types, especially decomposing flies. In this case, this is a male flesh fly, and they have a very, very complex reproductive organ. This organ, this adiagus as we call it, or the penis, is ridiculous. It has all these different flanges and bits and bobs and things hanging off of it so that it can only fit into a conspecific female's vaginal opening. If this male tries to mate with even very closely related species, his penis just won't fit. It just isn't physically going to fit there. So then we have this mechanical isolation where they cannot match with each other. Right? So these are some of the more common things that we're going to see out in the world, these mechanisms of isolation. So given all of this information, a species based on this definition has three major properties. One, it has a reproductive community. So the individuals of a species seek each other as potential mates for the purposes of reproduction, and the members form a reproductive community. So that community is isolated either by habitat or time of year or day or by their behavior or by mechanics. So it's just a single population that is isolated in some way. Two, they have a specialized ecological unit. So the members of a species differ from each other for many features, but all members together form a unit, interact as a unit, and interact with other species in any environment. Okay? And then three, they have a genetical unit. The members freely interbreed, consisting of an intercommunicating gene pool, whereas the individual is merely a temporary vessel holding a small portion and contents of the gene pool. This gets into some philosophical stuff, but do you really start thinking about it? So don't think about it too hard. I've got too many words to throw at you. So it's just this gene pool. Now, most modern taxonomists and evolutionists consider the biological species concept as the species concept, the most widely accepted species concept, simply because the maximum workers apply this concept during their work. So this is an applicable concept. This is something that we can work with out in the field. This concept, though, isn't fixed. It's always changeable. It has the potential for modifications as required by evolution. This is one of the things that makes it so workable. So this is a very useful definition, and this is why you have learned this probably numerous times throughout your schooling. However, it does have some limitations. It doesn't take into account things like asexually reproducing organisms. I mean, all of this is based on interbreeding, right? What about those organisms that are able to clone themselves? How do we consider that a species? There's nothing in this definition that can take that into account. We also can't take into account those organisms that are only found in the fossil record. So those things that are now extinct. How do we recognize an individual extinct species? They're not mating anymore. They're not producing anything else anymore. So what do we do there? So it's because of those issues that other species concepts are developed that we do use in the field. But this is probably the number one species. The next most common species concept that we're going to see in carrion ecology is called the ecological species concept. So in the ecological species concept, this is mainly about ecological competition. So in this case, a species is a lineage or a closely related set of lineages which occupies an adaptive zone minimally different from that of any other lineage in its range and which evolves separately from all lineages outside its range. So it has to do with where these species live and how they evolve together. Okay? So a species, in this case, is a number of related populations, the members of which compete more with their own kind than with members of other species. So when we talk about that competition idea, that means that a species is something that is going to be feeding on the same food, living in the same area, utilizing the same resources, and therefore competing with one another. But then they're also going to be mating with each other and producing more offspring. So it's that overlap of things. So in other words, when two organisms are similar to each other, their needs are more likely to overlap. Therefore, they are expected to compete, and consequently, they are more likely of the same species. So this is a pretty good concept, right? You know, they're things that are in the same zone, same area, doing the same thing, having that same job, so to speak, when it comes to their niche. Now, the ecological species concept, though, does have some complications. So it requires that the life histories of the members of individual species are the same. And really, practically, that's not always true. So we don't always see the exact same life histories in individual organisms in the same area. It also has a problem similar to another concept that we'll talk about in a minute, the morphological species concept. So that problem is, at what point does one stop the process of splitting divergent forms into new species? So when things look different or do something just slightly differently, where's the line there? At what point do we say this is a species, this isn't? There's no clear delineation there. Finally, it's not always significant to determine the degree to which two or more entities are competing ecologically. So this may not make a big deal or make a difference in the real world. So this, you can look at its habitat and its zones to define a species. But again, it has some issues. All right, so that's the end of the first portion of this idea of what is a species. Let me know if you have any questions.